Let's dive into this fascinating discussion about why the tithe isn't seen as an obligation for Christians today. There's this common narrative in many churches that if you don't give 10% of your income, you're somehow cheating God. But the biblical analysis really challenges that.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because the whole argument centers around the fact that the key scriptural reference, Malachi 3:8-10, was originally addressed to Israel, not to all believers today.
Right, and if you think about it, in Malachi it says things like, bring all the tithes. But then when you look at Malachi 1:1, it makes clear that these words are for a specific nation, Israel, under the Mosaic law. It's like, you wouldn't hold a modern sports team to rules designed for an ancient club, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Israel had its own temple system, a priesthood. The Levites didn't own any land, so the tithe served a very specific purpose of sustaining that system.
And speaking of the Levites, Numbers 18:21 tells us that the tithe was their inheritance. It was a practical solution to a real-world need in that time. Think about it. If you're in need of support for temple activities, a set tithe was perfect. But it wasn't then meant to be a universal, everlasting rule.
Yeah, true. What's even more interesting is how this argument is brought into focus with the New Testament shift. With Jesus and the New Covenant, it's made clear in Romans 6:14 and Hebrews 8:13 that believers aren't under the old law anymore.
Right, exactly. This is where it gets really intriguing. With Christ, the idea of living under strict Old Testament regulations, including the tithe, is replaced by a relationship that's defined by grace.
Yeah,
Instead of obligatory taxes, we see the spirit of giving as a joyful act.
and that brings us to 2 Corinthians 9:7, where it's emphasized that each one must give as he has decided in his heart, meaning that giving should be voluntary.
Yes, and that verse really flips the notion on its head. It's not about meeting a mandated quota. It's more about a genuine expression of love and thankfulness. It's like, if you feel moved to give, you do it out of joy rather than fear of a supposed curse.
Exactly. It's significant because many people live in fear, thinking that if they don't meet the 10%, they're somehow cursed or stealing from God. But really, the essence of Christian giving should be freedom, not constraint.
Right. And if we look back to the early church as recorded in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 to 45, the model was one of generous sharing among the community. People sold their possessions and distributed the proceeds based on need, not out of some rigid 10% rule.
That communal spirit really highlights that there wasn't a forced percentage. It was more about meeting the needs of believers and expressing their love for one another.
Exactly, and it shows that the principle was rooted in voluntary generosity rather than some imposed law. Giving was an act of worship, a means of expressing gratitude rather than obligation.
It really challenges the modern narrative where some churches use fear tactics, saying, if you don't tithe, you're cursing yourself. That's a far cry from the New Testament teaching, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, think of it like this. It's as if you're told that you have to wear a specific uniform every day. It just doesn't mesh with the idea that your clothing is a personal expression. In the same way, the tithe as a rigid obligation doesn't fit with the freedom we have in Christ.
Yeah. Here's a point where I do want to respectfully challenge something. You know that many people argue that returning to a tithe system might still ensure the church's financial stability. How would you address that without sounding dismissive?
Good question. I'd say that while financial support for ministry is essential, forcing a 10% rule based on Old Testament practices ends up being more about legalism. What we see in the New Testament is an invitation for voluntary generosity that's flexible and heartfelt, not prescribed by law.
And you can still support the church generously by giving based on your ability, not necessarily being pinned to a percentage. It's all about the spirit behind the act.
Yes, exactly. It's more about the condition of the heart. When your giving comes from love and gratitude, then it's a beautiful act. But when it's done out of fear, like fearing a curse for not meeting a tithe, it loses that genuine spirit blessed by grace.
Yeah, it's interesting too because it reminds us that the blessing of God isn't something we can earn with a specific percentage. The blessing is really rooted in the grace of Jesus, right?
Absolutely. And that's such a powerful message. God's love isn't transactional. It's not like you earn favor by hitting a magic number. Instead, God's blessing flows from a heart filled with genuine love and gratitude for all He's done.
What really makes this perspective revolutionary is how it liberates believers from a debt of obligation. It turns giving into an act of worship, not a forced duty.
That's true. It's like experiencing freedom in every facet of faith. When you're not weighed down by guilt or fear, you truly can give out of joy. It's simple, yet so transformative.
Yeah, and there's also an important cultural note. When the Bible speaks of the tithe in Malachi, it also points out that the blessings were meant to set Israel apart. It wasn't a universal law for every nation.
Yes, exactly. In Malachi, God even mentions that the other nations would envy Israel's blessings. That context informs us that the tithe was very much tied to that specific covenant with Israel.
Right. So translating that practice directly to the modern day, as if every believer should adhere to the exact 10%, overlooks the historical and cultural specificity of the original command.
Right, and it really makes one think. Whether imposing that rule today is more about tradition and control, rather than following the true scriptural intent.
Definitely. Which brings us back to the idea that, in the New Testament, we see encouragement for voluntary and joyful giving, where every person is invited to contribute according to what they feel led to give, not out of coercion.
Exactly. It's all about freedom in Christ. Let me throw an example out there. Imagine you're at a lemonade stand. Rather than someone telling you that you must hand over $1, they ask you, "If you enjoy this lemonade, would you like to chip in an amount that feels right to you?" That's the principle here.
I love that analogy. It really underscores that feeling of voluntary support rather than an obligatory fee. It makes the act of giving something internal and personal.
Exactly. It's so much more about the overflow of a thankful heart than meeting a fixed amount.
And that's the main contrast we keep coming back to, the idea of generosity versus rule-bound obligation.
Yes, and another interesting point is how the early church embraced giving. They didn't limit themselves to a 10% rule, but instead shared resources so that everyone's needs were met. That really represents the beautiful communal nature of the new covenant.
Right. It's a reminder that the focus should always be on supporting one another with love, rather than ticking off a financial quota.
Exactly. The entire discussion challenges us to rethink how we approach financial giving in the church. Is it about legalism, or is it about joyful, heartfelt generosity fueled by grace?
It certainly makes you question if some teachings might be more about control than about reflecting God's liberating love.
Right, and that is a crucial point. When the fear of not meeting a numerical target replaces the joy of giving, it becomes a kind of spiritual compulsion rather than a celebration of God's blessings.
Yeah, exactly. So to wrap up, the biblical treatment of the tithe points us to its specific historical context for Israel under the Old Covenant and invites us, as Christians, to a more liberating view of giving.
Exactly. It's not about being bound to a specific percentage, but about letting your love for God overflow in generosity, freely and willingly.
I think this approach really restores joy back to giving. It shifts the focus from obligation and fear to gratitude and abundance of grace.
Totally. And when the heart is in the right place, supporting the work of God in the community becomes a natural extension of that joy. It's a beautiful, transformative principle, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this conversation definitely challenges the conventional mindset about tithing that many might have grown up with. It's reassuring to know that the essence of being a Christian isn't tied to a strict 10% rule, but to living under grace.
Exactly. It's like shedding an unnecessary burden and stepping into the freedom that Christ offers. That way, every act of giving is an act born out of love. No pressure, just pure gratitude.
Right indeed. And I suppose the takeaway for anyone listening is to reflect on their own approach. Ask yourself, am I giving out of joy and love or out of fear of missing a religious quota?
Absolutely. And if you ever decide to give, let it be with a joyful heart, knowing that God's blessing isn't earned by obligation, but is freely given to those who live in His grace.
Yeah, that's the real message.